My name is Annette. I'm 32 years old, and the story I want to tell you starts the way most important things in my life have started, with my aunt calling me on a Tuesday. She called on Tuesdays the way other people send birthday cards or update their calendars. It was just the thing she did every week, reliably, for as long as I can remember. Tuesday evenings around 7, whether she had something to say or not. We would talk about her garden, about the book she was reading, about whatever had come across her desk at the law firm that week, and sometimes we would talk about nothing in particular, and it was the best phone call of my week, almost without exception. She called on one particular Tuesday 11 months ago, and I answered in my kitchen while I was making dinner, and she was different that evening, quieter, more deliberate, like someone thinking out loud carefully. She said she'd had her annual physical that week, and her blood pressure was higher than her doctor liked. She said she'd met with her attorney. She said, "Everything's in order on my end, Annette. I want you to know that. And if something ever happens, call Miss Vance before you do anything else." She spelled the name for me. I wrote it down on the back of a grocery receipt and stuck it on my refrigerator under a lighthouse magnet I'd bought on a trip to Cape Hatteras years ago. I told her she was being dramatic. She said she preferred the word prepared. She sounded almost amused. She died 11 months ago, on a Sunday morning in November, of a heart attack. She was 64 years old. By all accounts, she had been gardening the afternoon before. I want to tell you about the months that followed. Because what happened in those months, and then in a law office on a Tuesday in October, almost a year later, is really what this story is about. My family is not a loud family. We don't fight at Thanksgiving. We don't have screaming matches or dramatic blowouts. The imbalance in my family was always quieter than that, the kind that's harder to name and harder to leave behind once you've seen it clearly. My brother Curtis is 4 years older than me. He played travel baseball from the time he was 9 until he blew out his shoulder at 20, and the whole architecture of my parents' life, which had been built around his trajectory, needed to be quietly dismantled and rebuilt around something else. My parents spent, by my rough adult calculation, somewhere around $40,000 on his baseball career over those 11 years. Tournament registrations, travel, gear, private coaching, hotel rooms in Virginia and Georgia and Pennsylvania. My mother had a separate debit card specifically for his expenses. I know because I saw it in her purse once when I was 12, a card with a different bank's logo than the one she used for groceries, and she explained it to me as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I understand, as an adult, that my parents were not cruel people. They had a child with a visible talent, and they poured themselves into it, and they didn't think carefully about what that pouring meant for the other child standing nearby watching it happen. Most people don't think carefully about that. It doesn't make it nothing. It makes it a particular kind of wound, the kind you can't point to and say, "Here, this is where it happened," because it happened everywhere and nowhere and all the time. I put myself through nursing school. 4 years, a full-time program, and for 2 of those years I worked 25 hours a week at a chain restaurant near campus because I had no other way to cover rent. I applied for every scholarship the school posted. I took out loans I'm still paying down. I did not ask my parents for money because I knew, in the cellular way you know things about your own family, that there wasn't money specifically for me. There was money for things, money for emergencies, money for my brother's new apartment after the shoulder injury while he figured out his next step. Not for me specifically in the way I needed. My Aunt Rosemary was my father's older sister. She had worked for 31 years as a senior paralegal at an estate law firm in Raleigh, the kind of firm that handles wills and trusts and property transfers, not lawsuits. She was precise and practical in the way that people who spend their careers around careful documents tend to become. She lived in a split level on Pemberton Road that she'd paid off years before her death. She had a raised garden bed in the backyard where she grew tomatoes every summer and complained annually about the deer who helped themselves to them. Though she put up no serious deterrents because I think she didn't actually mind them that much. She drove a 10-year-old Subaru and wore the same silver watch every day and had opinions about coffee that most people reserve for wine. She did not have children of her own, and she never made this a subject of conversation or explanation. She just was who she was, and part of who she was for my entire life was someone paying attention to me in the ways that no one else in my family was. When I was a sophomore in high school, my mother forgot, genuinely forgot, not maliciously but completely, that the school year was starting in 4 days. I needed clothes and school supplies. My aunt drove 2.5 hours from Raleigh, took me to Target, and then to a discount clothing store on the edge of town, bought me everything I needed, and drove back to Raleigh that same evening. She didn't make a speech about it. She bought me a Frosty on the way and told me about a case at work that she found interesting, and that was the whole of it. She came to my nursing school pinning ceremony 8 years ago. I hadn't told my parents the date. That's a sentence I have to sit with sometimes, the fact that I simply didn't invite them. But my aunt found out through some family relay and drove the 3 hours without telling me she was coming. I walked into the auditorium carrying my candle, and I looked up and she was in the 4th row in her blue cardigan, alone in the seat, and she raised her hand when she saw me like she was flagging down a cab, completely unself-conscious about it, and I almost dropped the candle. My 3rd year of nursing school was the hardest year of my life financially. I was 3 months behind on rent, my car needed $800 of brake work I couldn't afford, and I had started calculating late at night with a legal pad whether I could realistically finish the program or whether I needed to stop and come back later when I had more resources. The numbers kept coming out the same way. My aunt called on a Tuesday. I didn't mean to tell her everything, but she asked how I actually was. Not how are you as a greeting, but how are you actually? And something about the specific sincerity of the question undid me. I told her the real numbers. I was embarrassed about it for approximately 45 seconds, and then she said, "Okay, send me the breakdown," and I did. By Friday of that week, $8,000 had transferred into my account. She told me not to pay her back. I told her it was too much. She said, "Annette, there are people in my life I can do something for, and you are one of them. Please let me do it." I let her. I graduated a year later. She sat in the 4th row. She died on a Sunday in November, and I drove to Raleigh that afternoon in a particular kind of stunned silence that is different from sadness, that precedes sadness. A flat gray state where your body keeps operating and your mind is somewhere slightly behind it, trying to catch up. My father had called from the hospital, and his voice sounded like someone else was using it, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a few minutes before I could stand up and pack a bag. My sister-in-law called me 48 hours later. She and my brother live in Virginia Beach, about 4 hours from Raleigh. She's the kind of person who does research. I don't mean that as a compliment or a criticism, just as an observation. She gathers information, she plans ahead, she knows the details of situations before other people have thought to ask about them. In this particular situation, she called me while I was still buying groceries for the reception after my aunt's funeral to ask whether my aunt had had a will filed with the county. "I've been looking into it," she said, and from what Curtis could find out, she probably didn't have anything formal in place, which would mean the house would go through intestate succession. She said the phrase naturally, like she'd been sitting with it for a while, which would pass to your father first, as next of kin. I said I didn't know, and that now wasn't really the time. She said, of course, absolutely." The funeral was that Thursday. My aunt had a small circle of friends, former colleagues from the law firm, 2 women from her book club who sat together in the second pew, and cried in the honest, unperformed way of people who have actually lost someone they genuinely loved. My parents sat in the front row. My brother and his wife drove down from Virginia Beach and arrived just before the service started and sat beside them. And my sister-in-law was wearing a dress that was appropriate in the way that things chosen strategically rather than instinctively are appropriate. Correct in every technical sense. My aunt's house on Pemberton Road was where we gathered for the reception. I had a key she'd given me years ago, the key she'd never asked back. I watched my sister-in-law move through the rooms with a particular quality of attention I recognized even then, a low-level awareness of dimensions, of layout, of square footage. She paused in the living room by the window that faced the backyard and stood there for a moment longer than the view required. The family meeting happened 9 days after the funeral. My father organized it, and he called it a family meeting with that specific phrase, with enough gravity to make it clear that attendance was not optional. My brother and his wife drove back down from Virginia Beach. I drove from Charlotte, a 2-hour trip I'd made hundreds of times, but that felt different that afternoon, in a way I couldn't entirely name. My mother had made coffee in the French press. She only brought out for company and served it in the good ceramic cups from the set she'd gotten as a wedding gift, and that spent most of their lives in the back of a cabinet. The care of the presentation was its own kind of statement. though I couldn't have said exactly what it was stating. My father said that Aunt Rosemary had been part of this family for 64 years, and that it was natural for what she'd built to come back to the family. He said that word, family, in a way that encompassed the people in the room equally, and I noticed the particular quality of that equality, the way it smoothed over any specifics about who had actually been present in my aunt's life for the past 3 decades. My brother nodded throughout in a slow, continuous way. My mother looked at me at one point and said she hoped I understood that this wasn't about money. It was about honoring Rosemary's memory, doing right by her, keeping things together the way she would have wanted. She said it with the calm certainty of someone who has already decided what a dead person's wishes were and is simply reporting them back. I thought about my aunt in her kitchen. I thought about Tuesdays. My sister-in-law mentioned, almost as an aside, that she had been in contact with an attorney in Virginia Beach who had experience with North Carolina property law. She said this conversationally, like a piece of helpful information she was generously sharing. Her attorney, she said, had confirmed that without a documented will, the default inheritance rules would likely apply. I said I would think about everything they'd shared. I thanked my mother for the coffee. I drove back to Charlotte and did not tell any of them about the grocery receipt on my refrigerator. Ms. Vance's office had sent a letter to my apartment, not my parents' house, which was the first detail that told me my aunt had been specific about this. 2 days after the funeral, I'd called the following morning and scheduled an appointment for the first available opening, which was a Tuesday 3 weeks out. I noted the day without comment. My aunt had always scheduled things for Tuesdays. I don't know exactly how my brother found out about the appointment. My best guess is that one of my aunt's neighbors mentioned the attorney's letter to my father when he stopped by the house to check on things, and the information traveled from there. What I know is that when I arrived at the office building on Capitol Boulevard, a low brick building, professional without being ostentatious, my brother and his wife were already seated in the waiting area. He had brought an attorney. The man was younger than I expected, sharply dressed, carrying a slim leather portfolio. He shook my hand with the particular firmness of someone establishing something, and introduced himself by last name only. I found a chair across the room and sat down. My brother looked at me the way he has always looked at me when he's trying to read a situation he believes he already understands. We were brought into the conference room together. I imagine that wasn't what Miss Vance had scheduled, but she adapted without visible disruption. She is in her mid-50s, silver hair pulled back, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she opened her file with the organized efficiency of someone who has been doing this specific work for a long time, and has learned what clarity costs people when it's withheld. She began. My Aunt Rosemary had executed a revocable living trust 14 years ago, Ms. Vance explained. She had amended it once 8 years ago and again 4 years ago. During that time, she had systematically transferred her significant assets into the trust, the house on Pemberton Road, her brokerage account, her money market account. Her accounts at First Citizens Bank carried payable on death beneficiary designations that had been in place for 9 years. The trust and all of these designations named a single beneficiary. She looked at me when she said it. My brother's attorney leaned forward slightly. And there's no will on file that would. The trust is the governing document, Ms. Vance said. A will would govern assets outside the trust. There are no assets of significance outside the trust. The property transferred into the trust at the time of execution. The bank accounts transferred at the moment of death by operation of the payable on death designation. She paused. There is no estate to probate. The room was very quiet for a moment. So what you're saying, my sister-in-law said, and her voice had shifted, lost several layers of its usual smoothness, is that there's nothing to. There is nothing to administer through the probate courts, Ms. Vance confirmed, in the tone of someone confirming a fact that does not require her to be sorry about it. The assets belong to Annette. This occurred at the moment of Ms. Rosemary's death, by operation of law. My brother's attorney set down his portfolio with the deliberateness of a man recalibrating. He and my brother exchanged a few words quietly, and then the attorney said the word contest, and Ms. Vance addressed that with the same measured precision she had brought to everything else. A revocable living trust established 14 years ago by a woman with 31 years of professional experience in estate law, with 2 subsequent amendments documented by the same firm, with no record of cognitive impairment and no prior beneficiaries who had been changed or removed. Such a trust, she said, would face an extremely significant legal burden to challenge successfully. She said extremely significant, the way people in precise professions use precise language, to be understood, not to soften. My brother's attorney said they would want to review the documentation. Ms. Vance said she would provide copies as required by law. Then she reached into the file and slid an envelope across the conference table to me. Cream-colored paper. My name on the front, written in my aunt's handwriting, the small, even letters of a person who's spent 31 years drafting documents that needed to be read without ambiguity. She left this for you, Ms. Vance said. She specified that it be delivered at this meeting. I opened it. My hands were steady, which surprised me. 2 pages, handwritten on both sides, on the personal stationery she used for correspondence she meant to last. I read it through once, quietly. Then I read part of it aloud. I think she wrote it, knowing this room was a real possibility. I think she always understood the landscape she was working within. Annette, the letter began. By the time you read this, Ms. Vance has probably explained the paperwork, and I expect the room around you is not entirely comfortable. I thought about writing something diplomatic, but I spent 31 years drafting language for other people's most important documents. And I don't have patience left for diplomatic when I mean something specifically. I set up this trust 14 years ago because I knew your family. I have spent my entire career watching families at the moment of loss, and I know what that moment tends to reveal, and I wanted to make sure that what I had built, with 31 years of careful work and 40 years of careful living, did not get pulled apart because I had failed to think ahead. I am leaving it to you because you showed up. Not just at the end, though you were there then too. I mean for years. Every Tuesday, every cardiology appointment you drove 4 hours round trip to sit with me for because you knew I wouldn't ask anyone else, and you knew I needed someone in those waiting rooms. You never made me feel like a transaction. You never made me feel like an obligation. Do you understand how rare that is? I am not punishing anyone. I made a decision about what I had built and who had actually been present in my life, and I put it in writing, the way I always put the important things in writing. You used to tease me about that. I hope you find it useful now. The house is yours. The garden needs someone who will actually deal with the deer situation. I think you might be her. I have loved you since before you knew what love was. I still do. Take care of yourself, Annette. You always were the capable one. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. The room held a silence that felt structural, like weight-bearing. My brother stood up first. He looked at me and I looked back, and there was nothing useful to say, and we both understood that, and so neither of us tried. His attorney gathered his portfolio. My sister-in-law stood and picked up her bag, and at the door she glanced back at me once. Whatever the look had started out intending to be, what it arrived as was something much smaller and emptier. The expression of a person standing in a place they had been very certain they were going, and discovering it was not available to them. They left. Ms. Vance gave me a moment, then handed me a packet of documents to review at my own pace and told me to call if I had questions. She shook my hand with the particular warmth of someone who understands exactly what the work they do means to the person on the other side of the desk. I sat in the parking lot for a long time before I drove anywhere. My mother left a voicemail that evening that was almost 4 minutes long. I listened to about half of it. She used the words unfair and family and Rosemary's memory several times. I thought about the 4th row of the auditorium 8 years ago. I saved the voicemail and have not gone back to it. My brother reached out once through my father, about 2 months later. I received the message secondhand and did not reply. He hasn't tried again since. 4 days after the appointment, I drove to Raleigh and let myself into the house on Pemberton Road with the key my aunt had given me years ago and never asked back. I stood in her kitchen for a long time without doing anything in particular. Her dish soap was there, the specific brand she'd used for decades, still most of the way full beside the sink. Her reading glasses were on the kitchen table next to a library book she hadn't finished. A history of the North Carolina coast she'd been making her way through slowly. There were 2 tomatoes on the counter, the last ones from her summer garden, soft by then and past their best, and I didn't throw them away. I left them where she'd left them for a few more days, which makes no practical sense, and which was exactly the right thing to do. The house appraised at $312,000. I've decided to rent it for now. A couple with a young daughter moved in last month, and they asked whether it was all right to use the raised garden bed in the backyard, and I said, yes, please. Absolutely, and I told them about the deer problem. The woman laughed and said she'd figure out a solution. Something about that sat right with me in a way I'm still finding language for. 7 months have passed since that Tuesday in the law office. I am still paying down my nursing school loans. I am still working my shifts, still calling the people I love on whatever day feels right. I am not fixed or undamaged. But I am taken care of in the specific and deliberate way that someone who loved me chose to make sure of, years before she knew exactly when she would need to. She saw me clearly. She put it in writing. She filed it with her attorney, and she never told me because she wasn't doing it for my gratitude or my awareness. She was doing it because she had looked at the truth of things and followed it all the way through to the end. I think about the fourth row a lot. I think about what it costs to show up for someone who didn't ask you to, and what it means when someone does it anyway, year after year, without keeping score. I am trying to be that kind of person for the people I love. I haven't perfected it yet. But I have a very good example to work from. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll subscribe to Quiet Revenge Tales. There are more stories here just like this one, and I promise you, you don't want to miss what comes next.